So our last example is a situation. So it's like a word problem, kind of. So we have that Victoria is selling pumpkin bread as a fundraiser. She spent $50 on baking ingredients and she wants to sell each loaf of bread for $10, but she ends up selling 7 loaves of bread. So let's first think about what is our X value, what is our Y value, because domain and range is all about input and output. So we first have to define our variables. So our X value is her breads. So we're inputting in the number of breads sold. So every bread that she sells is going to make some money. And so if we're inputting in a sale of a bread, then it only makes sense that our output is number of dollars made or amount of money made. So in this word problem, she's making these breads and she's selling them, and in exchange for having a sale of bread, she is getting some money. Let's also help ourselves by writing out a little bit of an equation. So you've all worked with linear equations before. I saw a lot of linear equations for word problems in your homework activity. So let's think of some main ideas. So she's selling each loaf of bread for $10 each. So each loaf of bread, which is our X, is $10. So we know that 10X is going to be part of our situation. And then the last thing we need to note is that she spent $50 on baking ingredients. So any profit she made in this sale situation, you got to subtract $50 because she already spent $50. So our equation for this is going to be y equals 10x minus 50. So that kind of helps us make number values for our situation instead of just only relying on words. And now let's figure out our domain and range. The interesting thing about word problems is that you can't just rely on this equation, because if you just looked at this equation, then you're like, well, any value for X works and any value for Y works. But in the real world, sometimes numbers don't really make sense. So that's why I put this little note here. What types of values make no sense in this context? And one thing that comes to mind is you can't sell negative loaves of bread. She can't have negative bread. So that's something that in this situation makes no sense whatsoever. So negative breads is an example of something that would not make sense in this situation. And so that actually really helps us already, because if we can't have negative breads, then the smallest number of breads she can sell is no bread. So this could really suck for her. She could have 0 people buy her bread. So our domain's lowest value is going to be 0, which means she sold no bread. So we said we can't have negative breads. What else doesn't make sense in this context? Well, you can't have someone come up to you and say, hey, I'd like to buy 3/8 of this loaf of bread. So it doesn't really make sense to have fractions of bread either. So you can't have negative breads, and you also can't have fractions of breads. So this domain and range set is going to be a little bit interesting because you're not going to have inequalities. You're just going to have a list of numbers that are possible. So for our domain, the least amount of bread she can sell is no bread, and the most amount of bread that she does sell is 7 loaves. And we can't really use fractions in between, so we're just going to list out all the numbers between 0 and 7. Because after one sale, she'll have sold 1 loaf of bread, and at the very end, her max sale was 7 loaves of bread. And so I'm going to have you use that idea and try and think about how we can find her sales sold. And what's really helpful is let's go case by case. So if she sells 0 loaves of bread, if we put in 0 right here, 10 times 0 is 0, 0 minus 50 is negative 50, which sucks because this tells us that if she sells 0 loaves of bread, she lost $50. And we're just going to keep repeating that by plugging in each possible domain into our equation. So do that really quickly, and then I'll have you compare answers in a second. All right, so here you can see that if she sold 0 loaves of bread, then she lost $50. And it's not until we get to 5 loaves of bread where you plug in 10 times 5 is 50 minus 50. This is the instance where we finally are not losing money, and the next instance we start making money. So situations are super special because sometimes, again, it doesn't make sense to have fractions of bread. So having this inequality of 0 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 7, doesn't actually make sense in this context because this is telling us that we could have 6.99999 loaves of bread sold, which doesn't make sense. So sometimes in situations you just have to list out the domain, and sometimes you just have to list out the range, which takes a little bit longer, but you know, that's life. So those